In the spring of 1905, when the last dirty snow still clung to the ditches and the fields lay brown and tired, John Kowalski decided to leave his village and cross an ocean he had never seen. The village of Biała Dolina was little more than a name on a tax ledger in the far eastern corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A crooked road ran past a whitewashed church, a few dozen low wooden houses, and then thinned into ruts that vanished into forest and mud. Smoke leaked from leaning chimneys. Chickens scratched in yards fenced with broken rails. On Sunday mornings the bells rang, but the sound carried mostly over empty fields, because more and more people were leaving. Jan stood in the doorway of his house, one shoulder pressed against the rough frame, and watched his children sleeping on the straw mattress that filled the far corner of the single room. The fire in the clay stove had burned low. Only a red eye of coal glowed under the ash. The air smelled of smoke, cabbage, and damp wool. His oldest daughter, Aniela, lay on her back, with one arm flung over her face. Zofia, 2 years younger, had curled herself against her sister's side, clutching the edge of the thin blanket in both hands. The boy, Piotr, had wormed his way to the edge of the bed. One small bare foot hung out into the cold air. Jan stepped closer and tucked the child's foot back under the blanket, his cracked fingers lingering on the warm skin. Behind him, on the other side of the stove, his wife was awake. "You'll catch a chill standing there," Maria said softly in Polish, her voice hoarse from sleep and too many winters. She lay on her side on a narrow pallet, the shadows making her look older than her 28 years. Jan did not move away from the doorway. He could see through the greased paper in the window, the faint silver of morning. In a few weeks, the fields would need to be turned. He would not be here to do it. "I wanted to see them like this," he answered. "All together, quiet." "They would be quiet if you stayed," she said. There was no anger in it, only exhaustion. "You don't have to go. Maybe this year the harvest will be better. Maybe the landowner will lower the rent." He let out a short, humorless laugh. They had said maybe this year for as long as he could remember. His father had said it. Now his father lay in the churchyard on the hill under a wooden cross that already leaned to one side. He turned to face her. In the dim light he could see the fine lines that had formed at the corners of her mouth over the past hard years. When they had married, she had been quick to smile. Lately, her face rested in an expression that was half worry, half waiting. "Maria," he said, sitting on the edge of her pallet so the boards creaked under his weight. "We both know what this year will be. The same as the last, the same as the one before that. The land is not ours, the grain is not ours, the soldiers come when they like and take what they like. Taxes rise, wages do not. The children are growing. Look at Aniela's shoes. Next winter she'll be barefoot in the snow. Our parents did not go to America," she whispered. "They stayed. They survived. They survived poorer than we are now," he replied quietly. "And there were fewer soldiers then." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to Piotr's soft breathing, to the faint crackle from the stove. From somewhere outside came the lonely bark of a dog and the slow creak of the village well. A week before, after Sunday Mass, Father Antoni had drawn a folded sheet of foreign paper from his worn leather case. He had smoothed it on the altar rail and read it aloud to a small crowd of men, while their wives pretended not to listen and listened all the same. The letter had come from a man who used to live in Biała Dolina, a farmhand named Stanisław who now worked in a place called Pittsburgh. The name sounded strange and heavy in the priest's mouth, but the words that followed were plain enough. Mills that burn all day and all night. Wages paid every week in coins you can hold. Meat on the table 3 times in 1 week. Boots with soles that do not crack in the cold. Afterward, when the others had drifted away, The priest had shown Jan a line he had not read aloud. America is a place where a man can earn money, but the money is paid in blood and bone. Jan had traced the words with one coarse fingertip until the ink smudged. Blood and bone, he already knew. In Biała Dolina, they paid those to the land and got almost nothing in return. Now in the gray light of early morning, he said, "If I stay, this is all there will ever be for them." He nodded toward the bed where the children slept. "If I go, and I find work, I can send money. In a year, 2 years at most, I can send for you, for all of you. We can have our own room, our own stove, maybe even a small shop one day. That is not a priest's dream. Men from here have done it." Maria's eyes filled, but no tears fell. She had been a farmer's daughter all her life. Hope, for her, had always been a small, stubborn thing, not easily stirred. "You promise you will send for us?" she asked. "Not just letters, not just coins in envelopes. You will bring us there." "I swear it," he said. "Before God." He meant it with a desperation that felt like faith. He would work until his hands split and his back broke. He would sleep in alleys or cellars if he had to. Anything, so long as it led to a ticket for a ship with their names on it. The ship ticket he had bought for himself had cost nearly everything they owned that could be sold. His father's iron tools were gone, traded in town. His mother's heavy copper pot had left the house in the arms of a woman who had always envied it. Even the spare blanket that Maria's sister had woven as a wedding present had gone to the moneylender. "You will send the rest soon," that man had said, his fingers lingering greedily on the coins before he shut them away in his box. He had a face like a dried apple, and eyes that never smiled. "Or your wife and children will answer for your debt. The empire is wide, but it is not so wide that you can hide from a ledger." Jan had nodded, shame and anger burning in equal measure. It would have been easy, in the dark corners of his mind, to hate the moneylender, the landowner, the empire, the faceless men in Vienna and Budapest who sent soldiers and took grain. But none of that would change what lay in front of him now. One ticket, one chance. Outside, a rooster crowed, thin and stubborn against the early light. Maria pushed herself up, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "You should eat something," she said. "There is not much, but you should not go hungry on such a long road." He was not hungry, but he ate anyway. 2 slices of coarse bread, a smear of lard, a clove of last year's garlic. Maria poured him a tin cup of weak chicory coffee, a luxury they had allowed themselves only because he was leaving. They dressed the children in their best, which was only to say their least patched clothes. The girls stared at him while he pulled on his worn coat and tied his bundle. A change of shirt, a pair of socks, a bit of sausage, a folded scrap of paper with an address in America, copied in the priest's careful hand. Piotr clung to Maria's skirt, thumb in his mouth, eyes wide and solemn. "Where is Papa going?" Zofia asked at last, unable to stay quiet any longer. "To work," Maria said. Her voice did not tremble. "Far away. He will earn money. He will send for us." "Is it farther than Krakow?" Aniela asked. Jan had been to the city once as a boy, to sell grain. To his children, that trip was already the stuff of legend. "Much farther," Jan said. "Across the sea." "The sea!" Zofia's eyes widened, like in the pictures in Father's book. "Yes," he tried to smile. "Exactly like that." They walked together to the station, a strip of packed earth beside 2 narrow-gauge rails. The station building was nothing but a shack leaning against itself, its yellow paint long since faded to a sullen gray. A crooked sign with flaking letters announced the name of the village to anyone who cared to notice. Few did. Already a small crowd had gathered, a dozen men with bundles like his, 2 women with babies at their breasts. A few older children sent along to help their fathers carry sacks and then to carry news back home. Faces Jan had known his whole life now seemed suddenly distant, as if they belonged to another world. The wind cut sharp across the open fields, bringing with it the smell of thawing earth and something else, coal smoke, faint but distinct. It grew stronger as the time for the train drew near. Maria stood close to him, Piotr in her arms. The girls pressed against her skirts. Her headscarf fluttered in the wind, loosening strands of dark hair. Her cheeks were red from the cold. "Remember," Jan told the children, crouching so that his eyes were level with theirs. "I will write letters. When I can, I will send money. You will show the priest what I send. He will help you, and one day you will come on a big ship. You will see the sea, and I will be waiting for you on the other side." "Will there be horses in America?" Aniela asked, the practical frown that reminded him of his mother creasing her forehead. "Yes," John said. He had heard there were more machines than horses, but that seemed too strange to explain. Horses and streets made of stone, and buildings so tall you have to lean back to see the top. "Will there be snow?" Zofia whispered. "Yes," he said again. "But I will buy you boots that do not let the snow in." He glanced down at her shoes, their soles cracked, the leather white at the creases. Piotr, sensing the tension as only small children can, began to whimper and twist in Maria's arms. She murmured in his ear, rocking him slightly. Her own lips pressed tight. The distant wail of a whistle floated over the fields. A murmur went through the crowd. Men shifted their weight, tightened the straps on their bundles, checked their pockets for the folded tickets that represented both hope and debt. Maria reached into her apron and drew out a small parcel, wrapped in a scrap of linen. She pressed it into his hand. "My mother's rosary," she said. "Take it. Keep it with you, so you remember where you come from." "As if I could ever forget," he replied, but he closed his fingers around it, feeling the familiar shape of the worn wooden beads through the cloth. Memory, he thought, could be a comfort or a weight. He did not yet know which this would be. The train appeared around the curve of the track. Black engine, gray smoke, metal wheels screaming on metal rails. To John, who had only ridden a train twice before in his life, it looked monstrous. A piece of the new century roaring into his forgotten corner of the old. It shuddered to a stop in a hiss of steam and a smell of hot iron. Doors were flung open. A conductor in a faded blue uniform shouted something in German. Few understood the words, but the meaning was clear enough. It was time. The moment he had talked about for months had arrived, and Jan discovered that having no choice did not make the choosing any easier. He kissed Aniela and Zofia, tasting salt on their cheeks. He pressed his lips to Piotr's warm forehead, the boy's small hands patting at his face. He wanted to say something to each of them that they would remember all their lives, something wise and steady. No words came. In the end, he only whispered their names. Then he turned to Maria. For a heartbeat, they stood without moving, their hands locked together. Around them, men jostled, children cried, steam billowed. The world narrowed to the space between them. "We will follow you," she said. It was not a question. "You will," he answered. "When I have enough. When it is safe." She nodded once. Her eyes shone, but she did not weep. He thought, not for the first time, that she was the braver of the two of them. "Go," she said, before they shut the doors. He climbed the iron steps, the metal cold even through the thin soles of his boots, and found a place by a smeared window. He pressed his palm flat against the glass. Below, Maria lifted Piotr so the boy could see. The girls waved with fierce, desperate energy, as if their small hands might hold the train in place. The whistle shrieked again, closer now, a sound like something being torn. The train lurched, hesitated, then began to move. Slowly at first, then with gathering certainty, it pulled away from the station, from the church steeple, from the cluster of gray roofs. Biała Dolina slid past his window, his house, the crooked fence, the field where his father had broken his back for 30 years. Then the curve of the track took it all from sight. In its place came empty fields, stands of bare trees, a sky the color of old tin. In the crowded compartment, men talked about Hamburg and Bremen, about the agents who sold tickets, about which ships were safest and which were little more than floating coffins. Someone passed a bottle of cheap vodka down the bench. When it reached Jan, he took a swallow that burned all the way down and left him feeling raw and suddenly, vividly awake. He slid his free hand into his coat pocket and felt for the rosary, for the folded scrap of paper with the Pittsburgh address on it, for the ship ticket. 3 small objects to carry his whole future. "I will send for you," he told Maria in his mind. "I will bring you across. We will have a room with a real floor. The children will have boots. We will not bend our backs over someone else's land." He repeated these promises silently, in rhythm with the clatter of the wheels, until they seemed less like hopes and more like obligations fixed to his soul. Outside, kilometer after kilometer of countryside rolled past. Villages like his own, fields striped with mud and the last of the snow. Narrow roads where peasants trudged behind wagons. He wondered how many of those men glanced up at the distant train, and wondered, as he had so often wondered before, what it would be like to be on it. He did not know that the farther he traveled from Biała Dolina, the harder it would be to find his way back, not only in miles, but in memory, in habit, in the slow, subtle ways a man's desires can change when the world around him changes. For now, there was only the train, the smell of coal smoke, the weight of the rosary in his pocket, and the echo of his own vow in his chest. In the early afternoon, the conductor came through the car to check tickets. He punched a jagged hole in Jan's paper and said, in halting Polish, "To the sea, then to America. You are a lucky man." Jan nodded, though luck was not what it felt like. It felt like standing on the edge of something vast and dark, with no way back and no way to see how far down it went. He turned his face toward the window again. The sun had climbed higher, turning the snow in the distant hills to patches of glittering water. Somewhere beyond those hills there was a port, and beyond the port there was a ship, and beyond the cold, indifferent ocean there was a city with fire in its sky and wages in its mills. And beyond all of that, he told himself once more, were Maria, Aniela, Zofia, and Piotr, waiting as if they were fixed stars, and he a man, in a small, creaking boat, steering toward them. He did not yet understand how easy it is, in a new world, for a man to begin steering by other lights. By the time the train reached Hamburg, Jan felt as if the old world had been shaken loose from his boots and left scattered along the tracks behind him. The city was louder and dirtier than anything he had imagined. Smoke hung between the tall brick buildings like a low ceiling. Carts rattled over cobblestones. Men shouted in German, a language that fell on his ears like hard stones. Horses snorted and stamped, eyes rolling white as they pulled loads far too heavy for their bony flanks. He had never seen so many people in one place. The train station seethed with them, peasants in homespun, Jews in black coats and wide-brimmed hats, women with shawls tied tight around their heads, children clutching bundles bigger than themselves. The air smelled of coal, sweat, stale bread, and the sour tang of fear. A man in a bowler hat and a threadbare coat spotted him hesitating by the platform and approached with the practiced eye of someone who made his living off hesitation. "America?" the man asked in German, then repeated it in broken Polish. "Do you go to America?" "Yes," Jan said, tightening his grip on his bundle. "Ship's agent," the man said, tapping his chest. He produced a grimy card with a shipping line's name printed on it in ornate letters. "I help you. Papers, ticket, luggage, small fee." Jan had already bought his ticket through Father Antoni's contact in town, a man the priest trusted enough to stake his own reputation on. He pulled the folded paper from inside his shirt and held it up. The agent's eyes flicked over it. "Good," he said reluctantly. "Third class, Bremen, ship in 2 days." He gave a little shrug, as if disappointed there was no more money to be shaken free. "You go to lodging house. Many immigrants. Cheap. I take you." "Where?" Jan asked. He had been warned in the half-whispered advice passed between men on the train about lodgings where a man might go to sleep with his money hidden under his shirt and wake with nothing at all. The agent pointed down a street that sloped toward a dull gleam of water. "Near the port. You must have address for the authorities. They ask. Better to be with others like you." He was right about that. As Jan stepped out of the station and into the chaos of the city, he realized how small and easily lost a single man could be in a place like this. He nodded stiffly and followed, keeping one hand on his bundle, the other brushing the outline of the rosary through his coat. The lodging house was a sagging 4-story building that smelled of boiled cabbage, unwashed bodies, and seawater. An iron stove in the main room struggled against the damp. Men and women sat hunched on benches, speaking in a dozen different tongues: Polish, Russian, Yiddish, Italian, something that might have been Hungarian. A clerk behind a high counter wrote Jan's name in a ledger, misspelling it without asking, and took a few of his precious coins in exchange for 2 nights in a narrow bed, in a room with 8 other men. He handed Jan a ticket with a number on it and pointed to a set of stairs worn into a hollow by countless feet. Upstairs, in the dim, crowded room, Jan lay on a straw mattress that smelled of previous occupants and listened to the building breathe and creak. Someone snored. Someone wept softly in a language he did not understand. Somewhere below, a baby cried and was hushed with a soft, repetitive sound that crossed any border. He pulled the rosary from his pocket and ran the beads through his fingers, lips moving soundlessly. He did not ask God to change his path. That choice was past. Instead, he prayed that the road he had chosen would not be a dead end. 2 days later, he stood on the dock in Bremen, staring up at the ship that would carry him to America. It rose above the quay like a dark cliff, its hull streaked with rust, its smokestacks belching a thick black plume that smeared the low gray sky. The name was painted in white along the bow, but the letters meant nothing to him. To Jan, it was simply the ship, the boundary between the world he knew and the one he did not. Around him, hundreds of people crowded the dock, families clutching bundles, men with cardboard suitcases tied with string, mothers balancing babies on their hips. Official-looking men in uniforms moved among them, checking tickets, shouting instructions. "Third class to the left," one shouted in German. "Women and children first through the gate. Keep your papers ready." Jan found himself funneled with the others along a gangway into the belly of the ship. As he crossed the narrow strip of wood between land and deck, he felt a strange lightness in his knees, as if some part of him expected to fall, to be swallowed by the gray water slapping against the hull. The steerage quarters were below decks, down iron stairs that smelled of oil and damp wood. Rows of narrow bunks lined the metal walls, stacked 3 high. Each bunk had a thin mattress, stuffed with straw and a rough woolen blanket. There was barely space to walk between them. The air was close and already heavy with the smell of too many people, in too small a space. Jan found an empty bunk, slung his bundle onto it and sat down on the edge. Across from him, a man with a thick mustache and a cap pulled low over his brow was trying to comfort a woman who stared straight ahead, lips moving in what might have been prayer. To his left, A boy of perhaps 12 clutched a small wooden box to his chest, as if it contained his heart. "First time on a ship?" someone asked beside him in Polish. Jan turned. The speaker was a broad-shouldered man a few years younger than he, with quick dark eyes and hands that looked as if they had done the same kind of work as Jan's. "Yes," Jan said. "You?" The man gave a crooked smile. "Do I look like I cross oceans every week? Name's Marek, from near Lublin. You?" "Jan, from Biała Dolina." He said the village name a little more loudly than necessary, as if saying it in this iron cave could anchor it somewhere in the world. Marek nodded as if he recognized the place, though he likely did not. "America, then," he said. "They say there are streets of gold there." "They say many things," Jan replied. Marek laughed, but there was an edge to it. "They say there is work," he corrected. "That's enough gold for me." The ship's horn bellowed, low and mournful. The vibration shuddered through the metal floor and up through John's boots into his bones. Somewhere above, ropes creaked and orders were shouted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the ship began to move. He thought of Maria standing at the station, of Aniela's serious eyes, of Zofia's cracked shoes, of the way Piotr's fingers had tangled in his coat. For a moment, panic flared in his chest, bright and useless. Too late now, he told himself. Too late to go back down the gangway. Too late to change your mind. He closed his hand around the rosary in his pocket until the edges of the crucifix bit into his palm. The days that followed blurred into one another. Gray light filtering down from small portholes, the constant heave and roll of the ship, the smell of bodies and bilge and weak soup. Men and women took turns climbing the iron stairs to the deck whenever the weather allowed, gulping in lungfuls of cold, salt-laden air as if it were a kind of medicine. The Atlantic in early spring was no friend. The ship pitched and rolled, its bow rising and falling in a slow, relentless rhythm that turned stomachs inside out. The first time a wave slapped hard against the hull, sending a shudder through the entire vessel. A child screamed and would not stop until his mother smacked him and then pulled him into her arms, both of them crying. Jan spent his first night leaning over the rail on the windy deck, emptying his stomach into the black water below. The sea took his offerings indifferently and gave nothing in return but more motion. By morning, his legs felt made of lead and his head throbbed with a dull ache. Around him, other passengers slumped in misery, eyes dull, skin gray-green. "Better than the fields?" Marek asked wryly, bracing himself against the rail beside him. Jan wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Ask me again when the ground stops moving," he muttered. But after 3 days, his body began to adapt. He found a rhythm in the ship's lurch and sway, learned when to brace his feet and when to let his weight follow the motion. His appetite returned in cautious steps. He stood at the rail and watched the endless water, gray under a low sky, then black under a night scattered with hard, cold stars. In those hours when the wind cut through his thin coat and the deck lights made small yellow islands in the darkness, his thoughts traveled faster than the ship. He saw Maria's face every time he closed his eyes. He pictured the girls in church standing close together, their heads bowed. He pictured Piotr's feet in new, sturdy boots, leaving prints in fresh snow. Work, he told himself. I need only work. I will not drink my wages away. I will not forget why I came. On the 6th morning, a cry went up that ricocheted through the ship like lightning. "Land!" Bodies surged toward the stairways. Children were hoisted onto shoulders. Women clutched babies and bundles, faces pale with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Jan and Marek squeezed their way up to the deck. The air was knife-cold, but tasted different. Less like the open sea, more like something solid and real. On the horizon, Hazy at first and then sharpening as they watched, rose a narrower band of darker gray. "Is that it?" Marek asked. "America." "Coast," someone answered. "We will see New York soon." The word ran along the deck in a dozen languages. New York. The name itself seemed to glitter. Hours later, the ship slipped into a great harbor, alive with motion, a forest of masts, smaller boats darting like insects between hulking steamers, gulls wheeling and screaming over everything. The skyline that rose from the water was unlike anything Jan had ever seen. Buildings of brick and stone climbed 4, 5, even 6 stories into the sky, shouldering against one another along streets that ran at sharp angles. "There!" a man near the rail shouted, pointing. "Look!" At first, Jan saw nothing but low gray water and the outlines of docks and cranes. Then slowly emerging from the mist, like something out of a storybook, he saw her. A figure of a woman, taller than any church tower he had ever known, rose from an island in the harbor, one arm lifted, holding a torch that did not flicker in the wind. The folds of her robe were cast in pale green copper, stained by sea and weather. A crown of spikes ringed her head. "Statue of Liberty," someone said in halting Polish. "A gift from the French. It means freedom." Men and women pressed themselves against the rail, eyes fixed on the statue. Some crossed themselves. Some wept openly. A woman behind Jan began reciting a prayer in Italian, her voice shaking. A Jewish man beside her murmured something in Hebrew, hat pressed to his chest. Jan could not find words. The statue was not beautiful, not in any way he understood. Her face looked stern, almost indifferent, but the sight of her struck him in a place deeper than language. "America," he thought. "This is real. I am here." As the ship moved past the statue, a low murmur rose and fell on the cold air. Snatches of languages, of prayers, of promises spoken aloud or under breath. Somewhere, a child laughed, high and bright. Beyond the harbor, on a low island dotted with red brick buildings and small leafless trees, a cluster of long sheds stretched out like arms. Smoke drifted from chimneys. A flag snapped in the wind. Ellis Island. The name had been on everyone's lips in the lodging house in Hamburg, on the ship, in the cramped bunk rooms. It was the first American ground immigrants would touch, and the first American judgment they would face. A launch came alongside the ship, and officials climbed aboard. Orders were given. The first and second class passengers would be processed on the ship or passed through customs in the city with only a brief formality. The rest, those from steerage like John, were herded together, clutching bundles and children, and directed toward the gangways that led down into the waiting ferries. On the ferry, the air was filled with the rustle of papers and the low murmur of rehearsed answers. Men who had never been further from home than the next village repeated the few English phrases they had been taught by agents or fellow travelers. "What is your name? Where are you going? Do you have money?" Jan had practiced too, stumbling over the strange, flat sounds. The address in Pittsburgh on the piece of paper in his pocket might as well have been a charm or a spell. "Do not say you are looking for work," Marek muttered beside him. "They want to know you will not be a beggar. Say you have work waiting. Say you have a friend." "I do not," Jan said. "Do you think they will check?" Marek's smile was thin. "America is big. They want strong backs. We are strong." The ferry bumped against the dock at Ellis Island. The doors opened, and a cold wind rushed in, carrying the smell of the city. Coal smoke, salt, something faintly metallic. The crowd surged forward, up a long, echoing stairway into the main building. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. Voices in every language bounced off high ceilings. Boots clattered on tile. Children cried, were hushed, cried again. The great hall was lined with rows of benches, each filled with people clutching tags pinned to their coats. Over everything hung a sense of waiting, of judgment not yet given. Doctors in white coats moved along the lines, their eyes sharp and impersonal. With gloved fingers they lifted eyelids, checked scalps, watched the way people walked up the stairs. A man with a piece of chalk marked some coats with quick letters that Jan did not understand. Those marked were pulled aside for further examination. When a doctor stopped in front of him, Jan forced himself to meet the man's gaze. The doctor gripped his chin, tilted his head, and thumbed his eyelids up to inspect the whites of his eyes. The touch was efficient, indifferent. Jan smelled soap and something sharp he could not name. "Open mouth," the doctor said in accented German. Jan obeyed, feeling foolish and exposed. The doctor peered in, grunted, then moved on without marking his coat. He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Next!" an official shouted, waving the line forward toward a row of high desks where inspectors sat with stacks of forms. At one of those desks, a man with a neat mustache and wire-rimmed glasses waited with a pen poised above a page. He looked up as Jan stepped forward. "Name?" the inspector asked in English, then repeated more slowly, in German. "Jan Kowalski," Jan said carefully. The inspector's pen scratched. "Age? 32. From? Austro-Hungarian Empire, Galicia, village of Biała Dolina." The familiar words felt foreign in his mouth here. "Destination?" Jan reached into his coat and unfolded the precious scrap of paper. "Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania," he said, stumbling slightly over the last word. He held the paper out with both hands, as if offering proof of something more than ink. The inspector took it, glanced at the address, and nodded. "Who is there?" he asked. "Family, friend." "Friend," Jan said, remembering Marek's advice. "Work in the mills." He said the sentence in German, then repeated the last word in English. "Work. How much money do you have?" The question came in German, brisk, practiced. Jan reached into his other pocket and pulled out the small cloth bag that held all he had managed to keep through the journey. Coins that clinked softly and did not look like much. The inspector opened the bag, weighed it in his hand, then poured the money into his palm. He counted quickly, lips moving. $15, he said. "Not much." "It will grow," Jan said in German before he could stop himself. "In America." The corner of the inspector's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. He filled in a few more lines on the form, then stamped it with a loud final thump. "You may pass," he said. He gestured toward the far end of the hall, where a set of doors stood open. Beyond them, Jan could see a glimpse of sunlight and the hint of water. He stepped aside to let Marek come up behind him. As he waited, he watched a young woman with a baby at her breast be pulled from the line, a white-coated doctor, already reaching for her arm. Her eyes widened, and she looked back over her shoulder at the man walking with her. Husband, brother, father, who could only stand helplessly as she was led away. "Do they send her back?" he whispered to an older man beside him. "If she is sick, maybe," the man said in a low voice. "Or maybe they keep her here until she is better, or worse." He shrugged in a way that said the outcome was in hands other than human ones. The sight lodged in Jan's chest like a stone. He thought of Maria, of how easily a cough could turn into something worse in the cold, damp house. He thought of the long ocean between them. Marek's inspection went quickly. Soon they were walking together toward the doors that led, finally, outside. On the far side of the great hall, a sign hung over the exit in bold black letters, "To the land of the free." Under it, the push of bodies continued, each person carrying their own mix of hope and fear across the threshold. As Jan stepped under the sign, something in him shifted. The Europe he had known. Muddy roads, bent backs in the fields, soldiers appearing like storms, fell away behind him. In front of him lay a place where no one knew his name, where a man's worth might be measured, not by his birth, but by what his hands could do. Marek clapped him on the shoulder. "We did it," he said in Polish. "We are Americans now, eh?" "Not yet," Jan replied. "We are men with $15 between us." Marek laughed. "Enough for a train ticket and a little bread. The rest we earn. They say in Pittsburgh there is work every day of the week. We will sleep by day and work by night." Jan looked back once, over his shoulder, at the red brick buildings and the crowded windows of Ellis Island. Through one high pane of glass he thought he saw a woman clutching a child, watching the departing crowd with a hunger that was not for food. Then the ferry horn blew, and the moment was gone. He followed the others down the ramp to the boat that would carry them across the short stretch of water to Manhattan, the heart of the city he had heard of his whole life and imagined only in pieces. New York hit him like a shouted word. As the ferry docked and they stepped out onto the wharf, the sheer scale of it pressed in. Streets teeming with people of every color and dress, wagons and carriages and strange electric trolleys clanging their way along iron tracks. Buildings rising so high he had to crane his neck until it hurt to see their tops. English battered his ears from all sides, fast and careless, littered with words he could not catch. Signs shouted for attention, in bold black letters: clothes mended, rooms to let, help wanted, no dogs or peddlers. In between were signs in other alphabets, Yiddish, Italian, something that might have been Greek. For a moment he stood frozen on the sidewalk, his bundle heavy in his hand, the tide of the city threatening to sweep him away. "Come on," Marek said, jostling his arm. "We have to find the train station, Pennsylvania Railroad, Pittsburgh." "Do you know where it is?" Jan asked. Marek grinned, the expression half bravado, half bewilderment. "How hard can it be? We follow the other fools with our faces, and we'll get there." They followed a stream of immigrants and travelers up a broad avenue that stank of horse manure, coal smoke, and something sweeter. Roasting chestnuts from a street vendor's cart, coffee from a shop window, sugar from a bakery where neat rows of pastries sat behind glass like small, impossible luxuries. Jan's stomach twisted, reminding him that the weak broth on the ship had been hours ago. He stopped without thinking in front of the bakery, drawn by the golden crust of the loaves. "Come on," Marek urged impatiently. "We will eat in Pittsburgh. If we start eating like Americans now, we will arrive with nothing." Jan tore his eyes away and forced himself to move. He had promised himself, had promised Maria, that he would be careful with money. Every coin he spent now was a coin not sent across the ocean later. At the Pennsylvania Railroad station, a cavern of iron and glass filled with smoke and echoes, they bought tickets west. The clerk behind the window barely looked at them, his English clipped and bored. Jan slid precious bills under the pane and received in exchange 2 small rectangles of paper and a muttered instruction he did not entirely understand. "Is that all?" he asked Marek, stepping away from the window. "That's all," Marek said. "We show the paper. We get on the train. We get off in Pittsburgh. Then the real work begins." They found their platform and climbed aboard another train, this one wider and somewhat cleaner than the ones he had known in Europe. As it pulled out of the station, Jan watched New York slide past the window, rows of brick tenements with laundry strung between them like flags, narrow alleys crammed with pushcarts and children, then gradually more open spaces, warehouses, rail yards, patches of scrubby trees. For the second time in as many weeks, he felt the sensation of being pulled away from something that could not be reclaimed. But this time, mixed with the ache of loss, there was something else. A thin, sharp thread of anticipation. America did not feel like a promise carved in stone. It felt like a game in which he did not yet know the rules. He thought of Maria, of the children, of the weight of the debt back home. He thought of the $15 left in his pocket. "I will not forget," he whispered, the words lost under the rumble of the wheels. "I will not forget why I came." Outside, the landscape widened. Fields, small towns with white churches, rivers cutting through low hills. Somewhere, far ahead along these rails, smoke from another city's mills smeared the sky. Pittsburgh waited with its furnaces and wages, its danger and possibility. Jan did not know it yet, but it would also be the place where the promise he carried, like a talisman, would begin, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to change. By the winter of 1907, Jan Kowalski lived in a narrow room that was not quite his, and yet more his, than the village house he still saw in his dreams. The room was on the top floor of a brick tenement on Penn Avenue in Pittsburgh, 3 flights of splintered stairs above a bakery that never quite stopped smelling of stale bread and coal smoke. The window, caked with the dust of the mills, looked out on a tangle of roofs and chimneys, and, beyond them, the dim orange flicker of the steel works at night. The room held 1 iron bed, 1 chair, 1 trunk, and a nail on the wall where he hung his coat. When he first arrived, he had shared the bed with another man on opposite shifts, one sleeping while the other worked. But after his first full year in America, Jan had saved enough for his own space. It felt in some small, stubborn way, like proof that his plan was working. Each morning before dawn, he woke to the whistle of the mills and the muffled thud of the bakery's first loaves hitting the wooden counter below. He washed his face in a chipped basin, tied on the same gray scarf Maria had wrapped around his neck before he left Białodolina, and walked down Penn Avenue with the other men, Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians, Italians, all of them funneling toward the same low, sprawling buildings by the river. Inside the mill, time did not pass in hours so much as in shifts. 12 on, 12 off when the work was heavy, 10 and 10 when it wasn't. The great open space roared with the sound of rolling steel, shrieked with metal on metal, flared with white-hot light whenever molten metal was poured. Heat pressed against their faces like a hand. Dust and grit worked their way into eyes, mouths, lungs. Jan's job was on the rolling line. He and 3 other men stood with long iron rods and guided the glowing slabs as they emerged from the furnace, shoving, turning, calling to one another above the noise as the steel went back and forth through the rollers, growing longer, thinner, more dangerous with each pass. The first weeks, the heat and the noise had nearly broken him. He had gone back to his bed at night with his ears ringing and his shirt stiff with dried sweat, the taste of metal in his mouth, his hands shaking from strain. But there was no other work that paid as well, and so he had stayed, and his body had learned the rhythm of it. The way you had to move with the steel, not against it. The way to read the color of the metal, dull orange to white, and know when you were seconds from being burned. "Keep your eyes open, Polak," shouted Miklos, the Hungarian next to him, on Jan's 3rd week, when a misjudged shove had brought the glowing bar too close to Jan's arm. "The steel doesn't care if you got a wife and babies back in the old country." "I know," Jan had shouted back, though his heart was pounding and the skin of his forearm stung from the heat. "You got them too." Miklos had laughed, not unkindly. "We all got someone. That's why we're fools enough to stand in front of the fire." Now, nearly 2 years later, the work no longer felt like something that happened to him, but something he did. His muscles had thickened, his hands had developed calluses. Even the village plow had never given him, and he could work through a shift with a kind of grim, practiced concentration that left little room for anything else. except always at the edges of his thoughts. Maria, the children, the promise. He had sent his first money order home 3 months after finding steady work in the mill. It had not been much. Just a few American dollars folded with shaking care into an envelope that also contained a letter, painstakingly written in his awkward hand. Maria, he had written, forming each letter slowly, the stub of the pencil slick with sweat between his fingers. I am alive. I have work in a steel mill. It is very hot, but they pay every week. I am saving. Tell the moneylender he will have his share soon. Tell the children. He had stopped there, the words refusing to come. Tell them what? That their father lived in a place where the night sky glowed like a furnace. That the streets were paved with mud and cinders, not gold. But that there was meat in the stew at least twice a week. That sometimes, when he closed his eyes, the roar of the mill sounded like the wind across the fields at home, and other times it sounded like the inside of a church bell. Tell the children I will bring you all here, he had finished finally. This, I swear again. Your husband, Jan. He had walked himself to the post office on Liberty Avenue, waited in a line of men who clutched their envelopes as if they were pieces of their own hearts, and pressed the money order across the counter to a clerk who barely glanced at his face. After that, he sent money every few months when he could, always with a letter. At first, Maria wrote back with the careful regularity of someone measuring both words and hope. We received your money, she wrote. The moneylender is satisfied for now. The winter was cold, but we managed. Aniela is taller. Her shoes are too small. Zofia has learned her letters from the priest. Piotr follows them everywhere. He says when he grows he will go to America and work in the fire with his papa. John had smiled at that, even as something inside him twisted. He did not want any of his children near the mills. He wanted them under a different sky, in a different room, learning different words. He carried their letters in the inner pocket of his coat, the paper going soft at the edges from being unfolded and refolded. On breaks at the mill, when the foreman turned his back and the men crouched by the wall to gulp water from tin cups, he would sometimes touch that pocket with soot-blackened fingers, as if to make sure the words were still there. But the saving went slower than he had hoped. There were the union dues he had decided, reluctantly, to pay after seeing 2 men fired for no reason, and a third lose 3 fingers with no compensation but a pat on the shoulder. There were the boots that had seemed so expensive when he bought them and so necessary once he had worn them in the winter slush. There was the week he had been laid off when the mill had cut back production and the envelope home had to be thinner than usual. And there were, increasingly, the temptations of a life that, for the first time, contained more than one kind of possibility. On Sundays, when the mill whistles fell silent for a few hours, the streets of his neighborhood filled with the noisy life of men who had spent 6 days inside a furnace. They spilled out of the churches on 16th Street and Liberty, Polish, Slovak, Italian, each with its own saints and its own gossip, and into bakeries, beer halls, and narrow saloons that smelled of smoke and spilled whiskey. At first, Jan had gone straight from St. Stanislaus Church back to his room, the echoes of the Polish hymns still in his ears, the taste of the communion wafer dissolving on his tongue. He would sit on the edge of his bed, spread Maria's letters on the blanket, and count again the dirty bills and coins in his tin box, whispering rough calculations to himself. A few more months, he would murmur. Then I send for the ticket for one. Maybe for Maria first, or for Aniela. No, for all at once. Better to wait and do it together. But the months slipped like water between his fingers, and the goal seemed always just beyond reach. Prices in the city shifted. The value of rubles and crowns back home went up and down. The ticket agent on Penn Avenue shrugged when Jan asked how much it would cost next spring. Who knows? The steamship companies raise the fares every year. You want to bring 4, you better save faster, friend. It was Miklos who first dragged him, almost literally, into one of the saloons on a Sunday afternoon. "You'll go mad if all you ever see is the mill and the inside of that little box you sleep in," the Hungarian said, slinging an arm around Jan's shoulders. "Come. One beer, maybe two. We'll listen to the band. There's a fellow from Lwów who plays the violin so sad you'll think you're back in your mother's kitchen." "I should save my money," John protested weakly, even as his feet permitted themselves to be steered toward the doorway. The sound of a fiddle did drift out, thin and plaintive over the clatter of glasses and the rise and fall of men's voices. "You send money home," Miklos said. "Good. I send too. But a man who never spends a coin on himself is no better than a mule. You are not a mule, are you?" The argument was crude, but it found a ready place in John's tired mind. He had worked 12 hours straight the night before. His shoulders ached, his feet throbbed. The idea of sitting somewhere warm with a drink that was not weak chicory coffee held its own rough appeal. Inside, the saloon was a long, dim room with a bar along one wall, a scattering of sticky tables, and a space cleared in the back where 3 musicians played. A fiddler, a man with a concertina, and a third with a battered guitar. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of beer. Jan let Miklos buy the first round and then, almost before he could think about it, ordered the second himself. The beer was cold and bitter and better than he remembered. For an hour, then 2, they sat, listening to songs that slid from Hungarian to Polish to something else. Half-remembered folk melodies wrapped in the harsh laughter of men who had all, in one way or another, left something behind. "Here," Miklos said at one point, thumping Jan's shoulder. "You hear that?" The fiddler had shifted into a tune that made the hair on Jan's arms prickle. It was not quite any song he knew, but there was a turn in the middle of the melody that sounded like the lullaby Maria had sung when Zofia was born. "Yes," Jan said, swallowing hard. "I hear it." "See?" Miklos smiled, not unkindly. "The old country is not only in letters and money orders. Sometimes it is in a glass of beer and a bit of music. Don't look like that. Your wife would not begrudge you 1 beer. Maybe she would not, Jan thought. But 1 beer became 2, and then, on another Sunday, 3. Not every week, not even most weeks, but often enough that a new kind of habit began to form, soft as dust, around the hard core of work and saving. It was not only drink. There were amusements in the city that Biała Dolina had never imagined. One evening, a Slovak named Juro took John to a Nickelodeon, a darkened hall where for 5 cents a man could sit and watch moving pictures flicker across a white sheet. The film was jerky and the figures ghost-like, but there they were. Streets of New York, not so different from Pittsburgh, with crowds of people who looked as hurried and tired as the men in Jan's own neighborhood. Then a scene by the sea, real waves curling and crashing, and a ship so large it filled the frame. "I came on one like that," Juro whispered. "So did I," Jan replied softly, though in truth he had barely seen the outside of his ship, having boarded it in the pre-dawn confusion, choked down his fear and spent most of the crossing in the dimness below decks, counting days and prayers. After the Nickelodeon, Juro grinned and clapped him on the back. "See? America has its wonders. Not just smoke and steel. Wonders cost nickels. Nickels were small. It was easy to tell himself, on the rare evenings he paid to sit in the dark and watch flickering horses and phantom streets, that a nickel could not possibly make the difference between here and there, between now and later. The letters from home continued. Maria wrote of harvests and illnesses, of the new priest who spoke too fast and the old well that had finally given out and been dug deeper. She wrote of the children, always the children. "Aniela can read anything now," she said in one letter. "She even reads the newspapers Father Antoni brings from town. She says there were disturbances in the city where you are, men protesting for shorter hours. Do you see anything like that? Do not get yourself arrested. We need you alive. Zofia sings all the time. She says when she comes to America, she will stand in the street and sing for the big buildings until they give her money. Piotr is stubborn as a mule. He asks every week when the letter will come that tells us to pack. I tell him these things take time. I do not tell him that sometimes when I wake in the night, I am glad for the time. Because as long as we have not left, we have not risked everything on a ship and a strange land. Jan read those lines with a tightness in his chest he did not have words for. He folded the paper, unfolded it, folded it again. Then, on a dull afternoon between shifts, he found himself standing in front of the ticket office on Penn Avenue, staring at the posters in the window. A colored lithograph showed a proud steamship cutting through impossibly blue water under a banner that read, "Passage to America. Safe, quick, comfortable." Below, in smaller letters, "Special rates for families." Inside, behind a wooden counter, a man in a bow tie and a neat mustache sorted papers in English, German, and Polish. Jan stepped in, the bell above the door jangling. "Yes," the man said in Polish that had been polished by a decade in America. "You looking to bring someone over?" "My wife," Jan said. The word felt heavy on his tongue. "And 3 children, from Galicia to here. How much?" The man asked questions. Ages of the children, the port they would leave from, whether they could travel in spring or must wait until summer. He clicked his tongue, did some calculating on a scrap of paper, and pushed the result across the counter. Jan stared at the number. He had known, in an abstract way, that 4 tickets would be expensive, but seeing the amount in black ink felt like a blow to the chest. He did a quick count in his mind of the money in his tin box at home. Even with what he had not yet sent to Maria, he was still far short. "If the fares go up again next year," the ticket agent said, tapping the paper, "this will be more. That's how it is. You want to bring them, you save. You don't spend on foolishness." The last word stung, because he heard in it the echo of every nickel spent on beer and picture shows. Every small indulgence that had seemed, at the time, like a harmless way of easing the grind of the days. He left the office with the scrap of paper in his pocket, the ink already smearing from the sweat of his hands. That night, back in his narrow room, he took the lid off the tin box, counted the worn bills and coins inside, and laid Maria's latest letter beside them. The numbers did not match, not yet. He told himself, fiercely, that they would. He would work extra shifts. He would skip the saloon for a month, for 2. He would drink only water on Sundays and kneel longer in the church, asking God to make steel prices rise. For a while, he did exactly that. He turned down invitations to the saloon, ignored the music drifting from open doors, walked past the Nickelodeon without stopping. The tin box grew heavier by a few dollars each week. He walked around with a pinched look that made his co-workers call him the priest and laugh. But life in the mill did not stand still for any man's vow. In April, a stack of beams slipped from a crane and crushed a worker in the yard. The man had a wife and 2 small boys in Italy. They passed the hat for her. Jan put in $1, the coin feeling as if it weighed as much as the beams. In May, the foreman announced that the mill would be cutting wages by 10% until business improved. The union grumbled, threatened a strike, then backed down when the company brought in a line of black men from the South and a few desperate newcomers from Ellis Island and parked them, silent and watchful, by the gate. "We can't feed our families on threats," Miklos said bitterly. "The bosses know it. So they cut and we bend." The cut wages meant that even with all his economies, the tin box did not fill as quickly as it should have. The price of tickets did not care about wage cuts in Pittsburgh. One evening, as he walked home from a long shift that had left his arms trembling and his lungs raw. Jan passed the saloon where the violinist played. The door stood open to let out the thick air. A song drifted into the street, the melody so close to the one Maria had sung to Zofia as a baby that his feet stopped without his permission. He stood there a moment, the cold wind knifing through his thin coat, listening. The music was a thin thread stretching between this street and another place, another time. "You going to stand out there all night?" a voice called. Juro leaned in the doorway, a glass in his hand. "Come in, Jan. One beer. You look like a ghost your own mother wouldn't recognize. It's no sin to sit with friends." It would be only one beer, Jan told himself as he stepped inside. Only one evening. He had worked hard. He had sent money. He would send more. A man could not live entirely on tomorrow. The saloon swallowed him again, as it had on that earlier Sunday. The smoke, the noise, the warmth, the way laughter and curses in 3 languages tumbled together into something that felt, for a few hours, like belonging. When he finally stumbled up the stairs to his room, hours later than he had intended, a few dollars lighter than he had planned, he told himself it meant nothing. The ship tickets would still be there next year. Maria would understand a small delay. Life here was harder than letters could say. He did not know it yet, but that small bargain with himself, just this once, just a little, just for now, was the first loose stone in a wall he had spent 2 years building out of duty and love. Once one stone shifts, it is easier for the others to move. On a Sunday in late summer, he sat in his room, with an unopened letter from home, on the bed beside him. He turned it over and over in his hands, tracing the familiar slope of Maria's name on the back, and for reasons he could not have explained even to himself, he did not break the seal right away. Down on the street, a brass band struck up a march. Someone shouted in English, then in Polish, about a picnic by the river. Men laughed. A woman's voice rang out, high and bright. Jan picked up the letter, then set it down again. For the first time since he had come to America, he left one of Maria's letters unopened until morning. It was a small thing, a day, a choice. It did not by itself erase the promises he had made. But somewhere, thousands of miles away, in a village where the fields were already beginning to yellow with the end of summer, a woman waited for a letter, the same way she had waited for 2 years, for some sign that the distance between them was closing and not widening with each passing season. In his narrow room on Penn Avenue, with the walls shivering faintly to the distant thunder of the mills, Jan did not yet feel anything break. He only felt tired and hungry, and for the first time since leaving Biała Dolina, just a little bit less certain about which world he truly belonged to now. By the time Jan Kowalski finally bought his ticket back across the Atlantic, America had already taken nearly everything it could from him. He was 56 years old, and his body bore the marks of the city as surely as a tree bears the marks of an axe. His right shoulder ached constantly from years at the rolling mill. 2 fingers on his left hand were stiff and crooked from an accident with a machine guard that had slipped. The cough he had carried since his 30s never quite left him now, not even in summer. The tenement on Fullerton Avenue in Chicago, where he rented a narrow room, had been home to him for almost 3 decades. Its wooden stairs sagged in the middle. The wallpaper in the hallways peeled in long, tired strips. Children played in the alley with a flat ball and broken crates. Shouting in English and Polish and words from other languages Jan no longer tried to place. He sat on the edge of his iron bed, his worn suitcase open beside him, and placed his possessions inside, one by one, as if conducting inventory on a life. A spare shirt, carefully folded, a pair of socks with more darns than original yarn, a photograph in a cheap frame of 4 men standing with serious faces in front of a blast furnace. The boys from the old crew, at the mill, taken sometime around 1914, Half of them were dead now. Underneath the photograph, at the bottom of a wooden box in the wardrobe, lay the small bundle he had avoided touching for years. An envelope with foreign stamps, the paper gone brittle with age. A rosary wrapped in cloth. A folded sheet of paper covered in his own handwriting. He took them all out and laid them on the bed. The envelope was addressed in a careful, uncertain hand. Pan John Kowalski, CEO Polish Rooming House, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, United States of America. The postmark was from 1912. He had carried the letter with him through 3 cities and more jobs than he could count. He had read it so many times that he no longer needed to unfold it to see the words. My dearest husband, it began in Polish. We have not heard from you in almost 2 years. The priest says maybe the letters are lost. The children have grown. Aniela is almost as tall as I am. Sometimes I look at her and see your face when we were young. Zofia still laughs at everything, though less than before. Piotr asks when his father will come. Each line was another measured weight. You promised we would follow you. You promised we would be together. I know work is hard there. I pray for you every night. But the children, they need more than prayers. The money you send is not enough. Prices rise. The landowner demands more. The moneylender comes and stands in the doorway with his hands folded and says nothing, which is worse than if he shouted. If you cannot send for us, tell me. If you cannot keep your promise, say it plainly. Then, I will know to make other plans, or at least to stop telling the children. Soon, your father will send for us soon. She had signed it, with Hope, your wife, Maria. He had never answered that letter. When it arrived, he had been between jobs again. The rolling mill where he had worked for 7 years closed after a strike the owners had won with new machines and desperate men willing to work for less. Jan had spent the following winter in a room scarcely bigger than the one he now occupied, sleeping in his clothes, eating when he could, watching the savings he had sworn to guard drain away like water through rotten boards. He had taken the letter out, night after night, read it by the yellow light of the gas lamp, and then folded it carefully and put it away, telling himself he would answer when he had good news, when he had real money, when he could send more than thin words. Time passed. The letter grew older in his drawer. So did he. Now sitting on the bed with the letter again in his hands, he realized with a thin, cold clarity that there had never been a good time. There had only been choices, and he had made them, one after another, until they formed a road. At first, he had chosen overtime shifts, Sunday work, anything that brought in a few more dollars and delayed the moment when he would have to admit he was no closer to bringing his family over than he had been the day he first set foot on Ellis Island. Later, as the years dug in, the choices changed. A beer after work because his back hurt. A card game because a man needed company. A new jacket instead of sending another remittance because winter in Chicago cut through the thin old coat he had brought from the village, and he told himself he would make it up next month. Then there had been women. Nothing serious. Nothing that looked like the picture he carried of marriage in his mind. A widowed landlady with a gentle laugh who let his rent slide once or twice. A dressmaker who lived 3 floors down, who liked to dance on Saturdays at the Polish Hall and drink sweet wine. An Irish widow who owned the boarding house where he stayed for a few years, who called him John and stroked his hair when he came home drunk and ashamed from losing at cards. They had never been replacements for Maria. They had been distractions. Doors he stepped through to avoid looking at the door he had left closed across the ocean. Now at 56, there was no woman in his room, no children, no laughter. The dressmaker had married a grocer. The Irish widow had moved to Milwaukee. The landlady was buried in the Polish cemetery under a stone that said simply, Mother. America had not been all cruelty. There had been good years when the mills ran hot and the money came steady. He had owned a suit once that was not second-hand. He had eaten more meat here than in all his years in Biała Dolina. He had learned to read a little in English, to sign his name in neat Latin letters, to say "Sir" and "Boss" at the right times. But somewhere along the way, the promise he had carried like a burning coal for so long had cooled to ash. He did not know exactly when it had happened. There had been no moment when he stood up and declared, "I no longer wish to bring my family here." It had been slow, like rust, a missed letter, a month with no remittance, another month, the realization that his children were no longer children, the shame that grew heavier each year, making it harder to write, harder to imagine their faces. And now his back bent when he walked. The mills took younger men. The foreman at the last place had looked him over, at the streaks of white in his hair, at the way he favored his right leg, and said, "Sorry, old-timer, we need men who can keep up." The word old had landed in him like a stone. For the last 2 years, John had swept floors in a warehouse on the south side, the kind of work the younger version of himself would have scorned as old men's work. It paid little. He lived on bread, potatoes, and the memory of better meals. The cough settled deeper in his chest. He might still have dragged himself through a few more American winters if it hadn't been for the funeral. One of the men from the old crew, Mitek, died of pneumonia in late January. They had buried him in frozen ground, the wind whipping the priest's words away, almost as soon as they left his mouth. Afterward, at the Polish hall, the men drank cheap vodka and talked in low voices about how many of them were left. "Do you remember when we came?" said one, his hair now more white than gray. "We thought we would live like kings here." "We thought we'd bring our families," another added. Jan stared at the cloudy liquid in his glass. "I never did," he heard himself say. The words surprised him, as if someone else had spoken. "I never brought them. I left them there." The men around him nodded, each absorbed by his own memories. No one asked him why. No one asked what had become of them. That night he woke in bed with the taste of wet earth in his mouth and the sound of the priest's Latin still echoing in his ears. He saw, with the sharpness of dreams, the station at Biała Dolina, Maria's shawl whipping in the wind, Piotr's small hand raised in a clumsy wave. He realized suddenly that if he died here in this city surrounded by strangers, there would be no one to tell them who he had been before he was John from the mill. No one in Biała Dolina would know he was gone. Maria, wherever she was, might still be waiting. It was, he thought, a terrible thing to vanish from the world like smoke. The idea of going back came to him then, not as a plan, but as a possibility. At first, he pushed it aside. What would he find there? Laughter, anger, graves, nothing, but the idea did not leave. It sat with him on the streetcar. It followed him as he swept the warehouse. It lay beside him at night. In the end, it became heavier than his fear. He sold what little he had of value. The extra suit, his watch, a pair of cufflinks he had bought long ago when he still believed a man might be invited to places where cufflinks mattered. He drew out the small savings he had left in the bank. The account opened with so much pride in 1910 when the clerk had called him Mr. Kowalski. It was enough, just barely, for a third-class ticket. Now on the bed in the tenement, he placed the rosary on top of the shirts. He hesitated over the letter, then folded it and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. Whatever waited for him in the village, these words belonged there more than here. At the dock in New York, he stood in a line of men and women that looked not so different from the one he had stood in half a lifetime ago, though now the station was more organized, the officials brisker. There were fewer Poles this time, more Italians, more people speaking languages he did not recognize. The air smelled of coal smoke, salt, and the iron tang of machinery. The ship that would take him back was older than the one that had brought him. Its paint flaked, its rails dinged and rusted. The sea, when they reached it, was the same. Gray, wide, indifferent. On the second day out, Jan stood at the railing, his coat buttoned tight against the wind, and watched the line where sky met water. A young man with a knitted cap pulled down over his ears came to stand beside him. He had the loose, restless energy of someone in his 20s, and the careful haircut of someone who believed appearances might matter in his new life. "First time?" the young man asked in accented English, nodding toward the vastness ahead. Jan shook his head. "Second," he answered. His own English was rough, worn at the edges. "I came to America long time ago, and now you go back." The young man raised his eyebrows. "Not many do. They say once you taste America, you don't go home." Jan let the wind carry away the first dozen answers that came to mind. At last, he said, "Sometimes you go back because you waited too long to bring home with you." The young man frowned, not quite understanding, then shrugged. "My uncle is in Chicago," he said eagerly. "He writes that he has a shop, that there is always work, that in America, if you work hard, you can be anything." Jan looked at him for a long moment. In the set of his jaw, in the brightness of his eyes, Jan saw a ghost of himself at 32. "Yes," Jan said at last. "If you work hard, you can be many things. Just remember what you wanted before you went there. Hold on to it." The young man laughed, clapped him on the shoulder, and moved along the deck. Jan turned back to the sea. If he allowed himself, he could still see the younger man he had been, standing on the deck of another ship, heading in the opposite direction. Pockets almost empty, but heart pounding with fierce intent. "I will send for you. I will bring you across. We will be together." What did that man think of the old one now, heading back with a suitcase of cheap clothes and a pocket full of regrets? He did not know. There was no use in arguing with ghosts. The voyage took nearly 2 weeks. His cough worsened in the damp air, but he made it to the other side. In the port city, he took trains that were smaller and slower than the ones in America. The stations grew more modest. Signs shifted from German to Polish. Field after field slid past the window, some better tended than he remembered, some left rough and wild. At a junction, not far from where the borders had shifted again in some war he had read about only in headlines, he switched to a narrow gauge train that looked, in its chipped paint and groaning wheels, like the younger brother of the one he had left on 30 years earlier. When the conductor announced Biała Dolina, the name sounded both familiar and foreign in his ears. He stepped down onto the packed earth of the platform and stood still for a moment, dizzy with the circularity of it all. The station shack leaned even more than before. The sign with the village name had been replaced once and then left to weather. The same wind cut across the open fields, though it seemed colder now, or perhaps his bones were thinner. The road into the village bore the tracks of rubber tires now as well as wagon wheels. A telephone pole stood near the church, wires humming softly. Someone had painted the church door a fresh blue. There were new roofs among the old tin and tile mixed with thatch. Jan walked slowly up the road, his suitcase banging awkwardly against his leg. A dog trotted out from a yard and barked once, then sniffed him and trotted away again, uninterested. At the center of the village, where the road widened slightly near the well, a few women stood talking. They glanced at him with the quick, assessing look of rural people who notice every stranger. One of them, older, with a scarf wrapped around her head, frowned and stepped closer. "Can I help you, Pan?" she asked in Polish. "I am looking for the house of Kowalski," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, heavier, touched by the rhythm of English. Jan and Maria Kowalski. They lived at the edge of the village, near the birch grove. The woman's frown deepened. She peered at his face more closely. "There were Kowalskis there," she said slowly. Long time ago. That house is empty now. She paused. Who are you to them? I am Jan, he said. Jan Kowalski. I went to America. Long ago. She made a small sound in her throat. Mother of God, she said quietly. You are that Jan. The other women turned fully now, their eyes bright with curiosity and something else. Pity, perhaps, or disapproval. What do you mean, empty? Jan asked. His heart had begun to pound. Did they die? The woman hesitated, then shook her head. Your wife, Maria, she left, she said. Years ago, after the war. She glanced sideways at the others, as if to see whether they would correct her. None did. People say she went west. Some say to the new lands. Some say she went to the city. No one knows for sure. She took the boy. The girls were already gone by then. Gone where? Jan's voice scraped. To service, first, the woman said. To houses in town, then. Some went further. One married a man from another village. The other, I do not know, it was a long time ago. Many left, many did not come back. The world seemed to tilt. Do you know when? He managed. When Maria left. The woman thought for a moment, counting back on her fingers. After the big war, she said, when the Russians came through, then the Germans, then the Poles. Everything was a mess, the money was bad, food was worse. Your Maria was proud. She did not ask for help easily. There was a flicker of something in her eyes that might have been accusation. She waited a long time for you, longer than I would have. Jan swayed. He felt, absurdly, as if he had been running toward a door for 30 years, only to find at the last moment that there was no house attached to it. Is there anyone, any neighbors, who might know where they went? He asked. The words scraped out past a dryness in his throat. Old Borek knew everyone's business, one of the younger women said with a grim little smile. But he is in the cemetery now. Maybe the priest could tell you something. But we've had 3 priests since then. The older woman reached out as if to steady him, then seemed to think better of it and let her hand drop. You can see the house, she said, if you like. No one lives there now. The land went back to the estate when your wife stopped paying. Then the estate was broken up. Now no one wants that field. Bad soil. Jan nodded, though the words washed over him like water over stone. He walked the road he had walked so many times as a young man, his boots crunching on gravel, his breath clouding faintly in the cool air. The birch grove was smaller than he remembered, or perhaps he had been smaller. The house stood where he had left it. One room, a low roof, leaning slightly to one side as if sighing. The thatch had been replaced once with tin and then left to corrode. One shutter hung crooked. The door was closed, but not locked. No smoke rose from the stove vent. He pushed the door open. Inside, the room smelled of dust and mouse droppings. Light filtered through the small window, turning motes into golden flecks. The stove stood in the same corner, its side cracked. The place where the straw mattress had been was empty. The floorboards beneath worn smoother than the rest by countless nights of turning bodies. His footsteps echoed more than he expected. Empty houses, he realized, made different sounds than houses that held breathing people and whispered arguments and the crackle of fire. He set his suitcase down and stood in the center of the room. The past came at him, not as a single picture, but as layers. The shape of Maria's shoulders as she bent over the stove. The sound of Zofia's high laugh. The heavy feel of Piotr sleeping in his arms. Aniela's serious eyes tracking his every movement. For a moment, he saw them all as they had been on that last morning. Maria's scarf tugged by the wind, the girl's thin coats buttoned to the chin, Piotr's bare foot dangling from the bed. They faded, leaving only dust. On the far wall, someone had driven a nail and hung a small, cheap, holy picture, Christ with a bleeding heart. His eyes turned toward heaven. It was not the one Jan remembered. That had been taken, he supposed, when Maria left, or perhaps it had fallen and been thrown away. He walked to the corner where the pallet had been and knelt, ignoring the protest of his knees. He touched the floorboards with his fingertips, as if the wood might hold some trace of warmth. "I am sorry," he said aloud, surprising himself. His voice sounded thin in the empty room. "I am so sorry. Sorry for leaving, sorry for staying away, sorry for every delay, every letter not written, every dollar spent on beer or cards instead of pushed into an envelope. Sorry for the pride that had kept him from coming back when he still might have found them." Outside, a cart rattled past. A dog barked. The ordinary life of the village went on, indifferent to the drama in the abandoned house. He stayed there for a long time. Minutes, hours, he could not tell. At last, when the light had shifted and his legs had gone numb, he pushed himself up. On the way out, his eye caught something on the doorframe. A series of faint marks, one above the other. He stepped closer. They were lines carved into the wood, uneven, at different heights. Next to each, in a hand he recognized as his own, were dates. The years blurred together, but he knew what the marks were. He had cut the first one when Aniela turned 5, measuring her height proudly against the frame. The second for Zofia. The third lower for Piotr when he learned to stand on his own. The last mark was the shortest. A small notch, barely a finger's width, with a date that made his throat close. The year he had left. There were no marks after that. He traced the final notch with his finger, then rested his forehead against the wood. Outside, someone called a child's name. Chickens clucked. Somewhere distant, maybe farther down the road, a woman's laugh rang out. Not Maria's. He would never hear her voice again, except in dreams. He stepped back, closed the door carefully behind him, and stood on the threshold of the empty house. There was, he realized, nothing here for him now but memories and ghosts. The people he had come to find were somewhere else, perhaps alive, perhaps not, scattered like seeds on wind he had not bothered to feel until it was too late. He walked back toward the center of the village. At the well, the older woman from before looked up as he approached. There was a question in her eyes, but she did not ask it. Some answers in small places were understood without words. "Will you stay?" she said instead. "We have a room. It's not much, but..." He shook his head. "No," he said. I have a place to sleep in the town. I will stay there." He did not add that he did not know how long he would stay anywhere now. The idea of returning to America seemed as absurd as staying here. He was a man without coordinates, unmoored from both of his worlds. On his way to the station the next morning, he passed the churchyard. The gate stood open. On an impulse he could not quite name, he went in. The crosses had multiplied. The older wooden ones leaned and rotted. Newer stones stood among them with fresh dates. He walked the rows slowly, reading names. His father, his mother, Father Anthony. Some he recognized, some he did not. There was no stone for Maria, no markers for the children. If they had died, it had not been here. He stood for a while at his parents' graves, then put a hand on the iron fence and looked out over the village. Once, this had been the whole world to him. Then America had been the whole world. Now both were pieces of a story that did not fit easily together. He did not know in that moment where he would die. Here, in some room in town, or back in a boarding house in Chicago, or in a hospital ward where no one spoke his language. It hardly mattered. What mattered, he thought, was that somewhere, perhaps in a town to the west, there was a woman who had once waited at a station for a train that never brought her husband home. Somewhere there were grown people, no longer the boy and girls he remembered, who carried his name, or his eyes, or his anger. He would never know for certain. On the train out, as the village slipped from view, he did not press his hand to the window this time. He kept his hands folded in his lap, the rosary in one, Maria's old letter in the other. The man he had been when he first left had believed that time and distance were problems to be solved by work and will. The man he was now understood that some choices once made could not be unmade. They could only be lived with. Outside, the fields rolled past, and then the towns, and then the larger cities. Somewhere beyond them lay the port, and beyond that, again, the ocean. He did not know yet whether he would board a ship to America, or step off the train in the nearest city and simply stop there. What he did know, with an ache that settled deep and strangely calm in his chest, was this: a promise unattended does not merely fade. It goes on, living in other people's lives, shaping their days in silence. He had left his promise on a platform in Biała Dolina in 1905. He could not reclaim it now. He could only carry its weight the rest of the way, wherever that way might lead. As the train rattled on, the rosary beads clicked softly between his fingers, each one a small, round reminder of prayers spoken and unspoken, of beginnings and of endings that come long after a man thinks his story has already been written.